I'm Maria Judnick, and I'm the coordinator of digital initiatives here at the San Jose State Writing Center. We're on location today with senior lecturer Tim Myers, a New York Times bestselling writer, songwriter, visual artist, and storyteller. He's here to answer a few questions for us. All right, so my first question for you is, Tim, what drew you to a creative career?
Geez, Maria, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I just think it's wonderful that you're doing this, and I love being part of it, and I'm honored. I'm one of those people who, when I often teach teachers, I'm going to draw a parallel there, and a lot of people who are becoming teachers, you'll say to them, when did you know you wanted to be a teacher? And they'll say, when I was 5 years old, I'd line up my stuffed animals and I would teach them. And there'll be a few people who want to be teachers who say, no, it came to me in college. And I'm kind of that second type. It didn't take till college, but I never thought about it. When I was growing up, it never crossed my mind. In 6th grade, I had a teacher, she gave us an assignment. We were supposed to write an essay. For some reason, I have no idea, because I was not a good student. I got an F in 2nd grade, and I decided to write a poem. And so when we turned this stuff in the next day, she said, all right, children, it's time to go out to recess. Tim, I need to talk to you. And I was like, oh, my corduroys, I can remember, were shaking. And she said, my first thought was, I didn't follow directions.
Oh, no.
And she said, you know that poem you wrote? And I was like, yes, sister. She said, I liked it. And I can still remember the shock I felt about that. So she encouraged me, and that's when I actually became a writer. But again, this was very external. What I realized over time, though, is that there were a number of events in my life like that, and I'm incredibly grateful to her. This catalytic moment where there's something in you that you don't even know is there, and somehow this brings it to life. So that happened a number of times as I was getting older, and I found the other weird thing about me is that I was doing these things. Once Sister Boniface got me writing, I've been writing continually since then. And the next year, my mom bought an old upright piano, and I started playing it after taking lessons for 5 weeks and then quitting. I was always doing it, but I never consciously even thought of myself as having anything to do with it. And I certainly never would ever have thought of myself as a writer or a songwriter. But the joy of doing it and the itch, I always think about the itch. Like I would always just want to play a piano, or I always want to, well, you know, you're a creative person. You know exactly what the itch is. So the itch is what drew me, but my incredible gratitude is to those people and events along the way that made the itch get so strong.
So Tim, you've been teaching for many, many years to students of all ages. What is it that you enjoy most, teaching all those different age levels, and what keeps you enjoying teaching after all that?
I love teaching different ages, and nobody's actually asked me this question before, so I really appreciate it. Yeah, there's kind of a bouncing back and forth that you get when you spend time, and for me, it's both spending time both as an artist and a writer and as a teacher with different age levels. So being around kids it brings so much joy into my life. I can barely express it. And it's not only the joy, most people, the kids, they're wonderful, they're funny, they're innocent. Actually, kids are real human beings. Some adults kind of forget that. Kids have their ups and their downs, and they're good and they're bad and all the rest of it. But what they tend to have that just constantly reinvigorates me is this very open, I can't even call it an open view of life because it's not always conscious in them. They have this just hugely open instinct about existence, which is a philosophical kind of way to term that. But in kids, it's just a living reality, and it just kind of brims over in them. So if you walk up to a kid, you can say something like, that pink unicorn on your t-shirt just winked at me. And the kids, they may be surprised, but they'll go with it. Right? Whether they're thinking of that as fantasy or crazy or whatever it is, they'll go with it. And so, of course, when you write for kids, also you have this tremendous freedom. Now, obviously, at the other end, what you get from older students and adults is you get the more naturally intellectual side of things. Adults are more discriminating. And so, as an artist and a thinker and a teacher, I love to go to the more challenging place intellectually, where analysis is part of it, where opinion should be based on deep thinking and multiple specific examples and all that kind of stuff. And kids, obviously, developmentally are still working on that, so they don't necessarily have that. But what I find is that these are two things that in human beings need to be in perfect balance at the center of our hearts, not to mention our minds. And of course, kids have a tendency to be too kid, not to blame them, adults have a tendency sometimes to be too adult in this. So that combination of openness and, I don't like the way we use rigorous in the academy, but deep thinking, critical thinking, all that. That combination is just incredibly invigorating. Kids, there's that great openness and they love to laugh and they're a wonderful audience, although they can be a tough crowd too. The thing about them is they're not going to be polite. They don't have it in them to laugh politely.
They don't have the filter.
They don't have the filter. They'll just look at you. But also then with adults, the comic potential. And I don't mean to speak about comic potential like this is the be all and end all of my life, but I find that comic potential is so intimately related to the social ambience of what goes on, that it's part of that social interaction. So in other words, I love that social interaction with children, and part of it is because of their whole approach to comedy, and it's a different thing for adults, and that's also part of the social interaction. And in each case, one of the things I love to do is interject stuff from the other world. So sometimes an adult joke to kids, which usually will bomb, but adults sometimes are open to kid-like humor. So that kind of takes us far afield, but that's from the question. But that's the way I react to it, and that's also the way I think about it. But the first thing is how I react to it, kind of instinctively.
Yeah. Makes sense. So we've talked a little bit about what you've enjoyed about the teaching process. Now let's think a little bit about the writing process. What's your favorite part of the writing process? And then also, what award or accolade has meant the most to you?
So let me ask you really quickly, do you have a favorite part of the writing process? It'd be interesting to see if we are on the same page with that, because writers are different people.
Honestly, I love the idea phase.
Oh man, that's so interesting you'd say that. I really love the idea phase too. And it's not, the thing about it is, one of the characteristics of a wannabe writer, and I don't mean wannabe to apply to anybody who's trying to be, I mean someone who actually acts like they want to be a writer and they won't do the work. One of the characteristics of that state is all they love is getting ideas. And you probably had the experience too, and I've had people I know really well come up to me and say, all right, here's the book you need to write, and they explain the book to me in detail, and they want me to take their idea and turn it into a book, and I'm like, okay, that's loving the idea phase too much, right? You gotta do the work. And in fact, one of the fascinating things about art is, and again, I know you know as an artist, the idea phase is wonderful, but the parallel to marriage and honeymoon is perfect. On the honeymoon, you have still, and again, we can speak as married people, it's not like you have necessarily over-idealized this person, but both of you are at your best. Well, obviously part of marriage is you're gonna see each other at your worst. And what makes a great marriage is the combination of the two. And again, this is in a way, this is a parallel to the earlier point I made. On one hand, there's that openness that children tend to have. On the other hand, there's those analytical and critical abilities and the toughness that full adults have. So I love the idea phase, but loving the idea phase never happens in isolation for me, because, in fact, I even have the shimmer of the idea phase always turns into a joyous determination for me to do the work. And I feel bad if I'm not doing the work because I feel like I'm letting the idea down.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah, so I knew we'd be the same on this. And I break the idea phase down into two parts too. And these can happen at any time. I think a lot of people are obviously, and not surprisingly, into that idea when you get inspiration. And we have all that beautiful mythological, or mythic, I should say, imagery about the god breathes and it becomes the wind, and the wind comes into you. The idea of the wind coming into you from beyond it, inspire like respiration, that's so stirring to me. And partly because it's not just a SAT word attack skill. For us, it's something that actually happens. Right? And people who've never fallen in love don't necessarily respond to a love song, but it's like once you've fallen in love, you got it. The love song evokes all this reality. So I love that, and that can happen. One of the things I've also found is the more I learn, the more I live, the more I read, the more that happens, and I love it. But the second part of the idea phase that I also love, which is sometimes more satisfying, the original idea phase, the immediate inspiration phase, sometimes I go somewhere and sometimes it doesn't. I write down a lot of ideas that at least I thought I was going to do pages of them, right. I don't do it, I don't get to it. And there's this one thing I want to write, and I have the name of the book. The book is called In the Sanctum of the Vortex. And the entire book is going to be about vortices, tornadoes, whirlpools, spirals, all of these. so I'm still in my initial inspiration phase for that, right? There's just that I'm magnetized toward that stuff. It's just, I can't resist it. But I have no freaking idea what that book is going to, and I've written things that maybe to be this, maybe to be short stories, maybe to be this. I don't even know if it's going to be a book. I mean, it could end up going to another form. So what I'm saying is, well, yes, by the way, yes. But I mean, not even just essays, maybe a musical piece, maybe a video with voiceover, a poetry collection. I have no idea where that's going to go. And so what I'm using that to demonstrate is there's that initial inspiration, which is still so radiant for me that I've had that thing it's filled up, but I had no idea where it's going to go. But I haven't come to the second phase. And the second phase is I guess the best way to talk about it is the coming together phase. A lot of times you'll have an idea and the idea is strong, but of course, now we always say the devil's in the detail. I prefer to say that the angel is in the details. The muse is in the details.
Right.
The moments that I have where I feel a book or a children's book or even a song or a poem or whatever coming together, it's an indescribable feeling. I mean, it's you're working, but what often happens, and I'll bet you feel this too, you're reaching for a form, you're reaching for a theme. With fiction, you're reaching for characters and all the rest, and things just kind of in a certain moment, and it's not like instantaneous. Like the inspiration can be instantaneous, like the lightning bolt behind you. This one is more like marriage. It's like this gradual coming together, the way people come together. Except in my metaphor, it would be multiple partners. I mean that because it's a bunch of stuff coming together into one. When the book, so if we're talking about a novel, when enough of the basic structural thematic elements and character elements come together, I know I've got a whole. And when I've got a whole, I have all kinds of confidence about filling in around the whole. It's like one of those computer simulations, right? You have a heart, that's your original inspiration, actual human flesh heart, and then it all comes together and the heart starts to beat. And then what's going to happen is the simulation is going to fill out the entire body around the heart. So that is just sudden inspiration is fun and glorious and thrilling and kind of a rush. But the coming together moment, again, I compare it to marriage. Now, I think your second question was about accolades. Yeah. Probably, it's interesting that those two would come together, that you would ask those questions together.
I had a strategy.
Yeah, I had it. Well, that's interesting. And I know you enough to know that you have a very subtle and profound strategy on this. I think all the time about this line from Nietzsche. I think, actually, tried to look this up in Nietzsche, and I think he said a longer piece, and people often over time, they paraphrase it down to a tight little piece. But what he ends up saying is the true writer would rather be understood than admired. And I find these words echoing in my head regularly. Being admired, yay, bring it on. I have no problem with that.
New York Times.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. And it would be ridiculous to claim that I'm somehow above that. I'm not. And in fact, for me, a lot of times my first thought was something like that is, oh, wow, I hope this will advance my readership. In other words, I want more readers, and I want more readers than I have now.
You want more people to understand you.
Exactly. And there's the bridge. Because accolades and awards and everything, they're good and all the rest of it. We live in a highly competitive society. Art is subjective. There are all kinds of complexities in that whole thing. But still, you work for stuff like that. But that's a means. That's only a means. And it's not like it's not a fun means. It's great to do. But the end is, again, this feeling of something coming together. And of course, the third phase, and this is, it doesn't always work this simply, but flash of inspiration, the coming together, and then completing the work. And that, the satisfaction of that, again, for people like us who just feel this ontologically, it's just in our bones, I mean, the satisfaction, to me, it's the satisfaction that I can only see of as spiritual, because it has to do with the very nature of my existence and why I'm here. And it's not like, God told Tim to write this novel. And if you use the word destiny, it can get, I don't want to go too far with that, but there is this sense, in fact, it's like the destiny of an apple seed. Yes, it's a calling. That's exactly right. The apple seed in the ground has a destiny, has a calling. It has a path. And if it becomes an apple tree, then something beautiful has happened. And if it produces apples, there's this peace that comes from that fruitfulness. So again, I come back to fruitfulness. So again, accolades and everything are great, but if you are interacting with people who understand your work as an artist, it's interesting too, because you'd think, oh, there's artists and then there's audience. And obviously that is a real distinction. But and accolades tend to make that more split. Mm-hmm. Like, here are unawarded people and here's an awarded person. And who would think of it that way, right? But being understood is different. But even then, it's still like, I'm the artist, I want to be understood by you. Well, what happens when art really works at its most fundamental level is that the artist and the audience enter into a dialogue. And then it's human beings talking about life or interacting about life. Now, it's interesting because the two of us, both being creative writers, both being teachers, this almost automatically, just like every time we meet, becomes a dialogue. Right. And it wouldn't matter if you were asked any questions or I was asked a question, if I was reading your work, if you were reading my work. So coming down to that basic human exchange model of this whole thing, again, the fruitfulness of that is something, and again, I imagine it's the same for you. In that way, I don't see a distinction between my teaching and my art, because both are concerned with humans interacting for the good of the world. Right. So, yeah.
So you're a very prolific and multi-talented creative person. Can you tell us a little bit about, you've talked about the writing process. Do you tend to stick with one project at a time, or are you often sort of flitting between projects? How do you move from that inspiration striking to the work itself?
I actually really love this question in a way that makes me nervous that I might be too self-indulgent in answering it. So sometimes to me, it also has an importance because the part of becoming an artist is actually becoming intimately and powerfully aware of what your processes are. So it's a very important thing. And for me, it's also very personally and philosophically relevant because the combination of art forms and other work that I do is a big part of my life, and also practically, it's a stupid marketing decision on my part. There's a lot of risk in this in terms of promo. We live in the age of branding. I've actually written some about this, and a lot of writers are being told, you gotta brand yourself, and I'm like, to a degree, yes, of course. Anybody who knows social media knows that you have a certain image, and this was true before social media, and the clearer that image is, the easier it is for your work to be spread. Bob Dylan, for example, is a living brand. He doesn't have to brand. Right. Every time he opens his mouth, he's branding himself as Bob Dylan. But somebody like me, who's very different, I'm different from Bob Dylan in a lot of ways, although I share geriatricness with him now. But I'm really different, and my practical challenge with this is that I'm a generalist in a specialist world. And I don't mean to overstate it, there's still generalists in the world, but so much today is so oriented towards specialization. Generalists are at a disadvantage in a lot of practical ways. And one of the disadvantage I worry about the most, I can live without being a brand. And I can live with the challenges of the field, because creative work is always super competitive, always.
Right.
And has it gotten worse or better with the digital revolution? It's gotten better, and it's gotten worse simultaneously. Right? But the one thing that worries me is not having time for each. It's like I'm a parent of multiple kids. This is me talking as the oldest of 11 kids from a traditional Catholic family. Are you giving each child enough? And I love them all so much. I want to give them all everything, right? So what I often say is, I'm a monogamist in life and a polygamist in art. And in art, I'm a wild polygamist, right? And again, sometimes I've had this conflict in my own head and heart many times, which is, you're spreading yourself too thin. You're doing too much. Why not focus, at least for a time, on one thing and try to get a larger success that way? How do I pick one kid from my kids? There are parents in the world who have favorite children. That's horrible. You love your kids unconditionally, every one of them. And I don't mean to over-stress that or over-apply that metaphor, but what I've found in answer to that very important practical challenge that I keep throwing to myself, and that many people in the world of advising creative artists throw at us, is I can't do it. I have to follow this. One of the most beautiful things about being an artist is something that I find is rarely remarked on. And so many people have a kind of a worship for artists, or they think of us as being so elevated and everything. It's like you get to work with creativity. Yeah, that's amazing. You get to, there are all kinds of great things about being an artist. The one I don't hear talked about enough is I actually, to be the best artist I can be, pardon me, I actually have to follow my nose. I mean, I actually have to follow what calls me. You used the term earlier, calling. Well, calling in the sense of vocation is that huge calling, but that vocation, that calling, it's like sunlight coming through a prism. It breaks down into all these little callings. I'm walking down the sidewalk, I see a bird on the branch, I'm like, that song was so beautiful. That's a calling, right? I'm being pulled towards something. And to think that I would ever stop that or somehow say, well, I can incorporate that in the song. Yeah, or just that bird. When we've got, a million gazillion, well, actually we're losing some of our birds, but that's another issue. So one of my rules is I never say no to the muse. Never. It was one of those questions, right? If you had to choose between writing or music, which would you choose? I reject the question.
You would swim.
The premise of that's exactly right. Thank you. Much better. I would swim. And I might drown.
You have an infectious passion for creativity.
Thank you.
So what kind of advice would you give to someone who's struggling to love writing or struggling to love creativity, or even just someone that's starting out? What would you like to tell them?
So one thing I would do, and I really like the fact that you differentiated there, because those are 3 different categories. In fact, the first one for me tends to be, not completely, but tends to be an educational category. I was a classroom teacher, middle school and high school, for 14 years, and I was almost always an English teacher. I taught some other things too. And then I was a university teacher educator for almost 20 years, for 19 years, 3 different universities. And much of my work, probably the majority of it, was about writing, the teaching of writing. Now, having all that experience doesn't necessarily mean squat. I've known people who've been in education their entire lives, and I didn't think they had much to say about it. But I often think about this question because, and again, as teachers of writing, we constantly think about it. Or I shouldn't say that, some of us do, and some of us do not, and therein lies the problem, right? One of the big problems. Writing is a global skill. It's very complicated. Writing, some people say, oh, freshman comp course, how complicated it can be. Oh my God, we know.
So many layers.
So many layers, so many aspects to the writing, and so many different students coming in different contexts, different rhetorical contexts, different classroom needs, and then all the bigger issues of writing in the so-called real world. So it's complicated. So I don't mean to sound like I can have some kind, the last thing you want is these reductionist placard-like things, like to write, all you have to do is whatever. But I think there are 2 things that, for me, it really comes down to being 2 really fundamental principles. And so I'm an individual, and I have a lot of experience, but I can't say I know exactly how writing instruction happens all over the world or all over the United States. But I have a pretty strong impression. By the way, 14 years in classrooms overseas, all over the United States.
Right.
20 years all over the United States. And now, and you have the same situation I have with this, I teach 6 sections of freshmen every year who are coming out of the school system. So I see the direct results of writing education in the United States. So I'm going to speak impressionistically, but I have a lot of confidence in my overall impression of how this is done. And of course, I don't mean to say, number one, that all high school or middle school teachers are bad writing teachers. In fact, there are lots of great ones. My daughter came up, my sons came up. My daughter had 2 fantastic teachers at Santa Clara High School here in Santa Clara, in the South Bay, who were, that school was not considered, it's not Harker, it's not Pinewood, and yet she had 2 of the greatest teachers I've ever seen.
Good teachers are everywhere.
Good teachers are everywhere. I also don't mean to sound like I think I'm the king of the writing world and everybody needs to do exactly what I say. But, experience, and plus the experience, again, which is something you have, the experience of being not only a writing teacher, but a writer at the same time, which makes a huge difference. So the 2 principles. Number 1 comes from Peter Elbow, the great writing guru. Some of the stuff he said back in the 70s and 80s is as relevant today as it ever was. And I've got a son who's a PhD in comp rhet, and I've got colleagues who are comp rhet. It's not like that field stands still, but some of the core stuff I think applies. Peter Elbow had the nerve to make the radical statement that there is no formula for good writing.
Yeah.
And so much flows from that. If you agree that there is no formula for good writing, that's going to change the way you teach. And I'm very cognizant of your question being, what about the student or the person who doesn't like writing. And I'm speaking about the way writing is taught because I think that is the most likely candidate, yes, the strongest influence perhaps, obviously individuals can differ, for how people feel about writing. So first of all, writing is often taught as a formula. It doesn't mean you can't teach guidelines. Of course you can teach guidelines, but it's like falling in love. If somebody says to you, I got a formula for, first date, should this happen? The second date, you're like, no, that's ridiculous. And yet sometimes we do that with writing. You do this, you do this, you do this, you do this. Guidelines, if on the second date he says this, red flag, but even red flags are up for discussion. So part of it is not seeing writing as a formula. And the not seeing writing as a formula, seeing it as a human act, a human behavior like falling in love, that complicated, that mysterious, that instinct driven, also open to analysis. People who fall in love without any analysis often get themselves in big trouble down the line. Seeing it that way fits with the second point, and it's how people feel about it. Mm-hmm. And I think it's, I talk all the time about motivation in education. No matter how great your pedagogy is, no matter how awesome your professors are at your university and how much they've published, no matter how much you've had, if that student, it's like a car. If you design this perfect car, but there's no fuel in the tank, be it gas or be it sunlight or bananas like in Back to the Future, if there's no fuel in the tank,
you're not going to run.
It's for naught. And in fact, what happens is even worse because you sit in the car thinking I'm going to go somewhere and you don't, and you assume, you say the car's crap. And the car isn't crap. What's happening is there's no motivation. So I start every writing class and most of my classes by telling a story. Mm-hmm. The very first thing we do. And the story is always about the theme, but it's a story that I tell. And so I'll say to my students, so why do you think I spent this time to be in this class telling you a story? And some student will almost invariably say, well, this sounds really weird and I don't think it's right, but maybe you wanted us to enjoy it? I'm like, yes. I want the first note in my class to be that in shared language experiences, we can find enjoyment, entertainment, interest, relevance. Now, whether they actually like the story or not is up to them. So when I think of people struggling to get there, I'm like, my first thought is go find a bunch of stuff you want to read. And I mean, find stuff that you want to read, and I don't care what it is. Yeah. I mean, not how to make a nuclear bomb manual, but whatever. So when it comes to writing, I'll tell you, and I'll give you the fast version of it too. So I did boil this down. If you want to be a writer, read, write, live. That is the path. It's general. We can talk about the specifics later, but that is the path.
We hope you've enjoyed this latest installment of Interviews with Local Writers. If you'd like to learn more about Tim Myers, you can check out his website at timmyersstorysong.com.